Thank you. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much for having us here today. It's truly an honor for both Henry and myself, and in a sense feeling so lucky because we often talk to crowds that aren't necessarily the most optimistic, and yet here we are with an audience full of people who are ready to help us change the world, which is fabulous. You've already heard a little bit about me, and you've heard a little bit about Henry, but you might be wondering, what are we here to talk about? And we thought the same thing at first, too. Two of the themes of this conference that really struck us were ideas and power of the people. And of course, we work with people all over the world who are trying to get some power, and it's very difficult, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little while. But the other idea that struck us that was so interesting of the themes was innovation for a better world. And for us, there was a bit of irony because we deal with people who are using innovation not necessarily to create a better world. And I can think of few experiences of innovation that were as powerful as that of 9/11. Because obviously the idea to take a plane that my mom and others were on and turn it into a missile and kill thousands of individuals was a very innovative idea. We can't deny that fact. And we've seen terrorists use innovation repeatedly ever since then, and quite frankly before. But we've seen it in 2006 when terrorists decided to use liquids to try to blow up planes. And any of you who traveled here on a plane know that very well because you were only allowed to bring a tiny little bag full of 100 ml containers. And we've also seen terrorists, Richard Reed in particular, use shoes to try to blow up planes. And many of you had to take off your shoes when you came here. We saw an individual try to use his underpants to try to blow up a plane. And luckily, aviation security hasn't advanced that far that you had to disclose any of your undergarments to security professionals. But we have seen these innovations. And from our perspective, as somebody who woke up one day and had her whole life changed because my mom was murdered, and has met people who have had similarly awful, if not more awful, experiences, whether losing loved ones or having their legs blown off in 9/11, or being burned over 62% of their body at a bombing in a hotel in Jakarta, we thought, well, how can we use innovation to be able to fight fire with fire and provide a counter-narrative to that of the extremists? So in 2008, the UN held a symposium on supporting victims of terrorism. I was invited to represent American victims, and there were victims from all over the globe. And what was so interesting was that while we spoke different languages and practiced different religions, we dressed differently, we acted differently, we were all there for the exact same reason, which was to make sure that what happened to us and to our loved ones never happens again. And we thought it was really great to get a chance to go to the UN and sit in that big room with all those vaulted ceilings and people from lots of places in the world with their little name tags showing their countries, and get that interesting experience and watch them bicker over political decisions. But for us, it wasn't political at all. It was an idea of how do we get to speak out? And the UN's a great place, but let's face it, the people who we need to speak to, the people who are sympathetic to the grievances expressed by terrorists, they're not listening at the UN. But they are listening other places. So we thought, let's start our own organization, and we created Global Survivors Network. And we began speaking out in Jordan, is where we launched. We had the patronage of Her Majesty Queen Rania, which was pretty spectacular. I have to admit, I had to ask what it meant to get patronage. Being American, we don't understand those things. But it's a really big deal. It was very exciting. We then went over to Indonesia. We've done events in Pakistan, in Africa, in the Americas, all over. And we realized every time a terrorist speaks out, we want to be there to counter them. Because quite frankly, they continue to get this bully pulpit. And we always listen to what they have to say, and we analyze it, and we think about their motives, and we spend all our time focusing on them and not on the people we really need to hear from. So because bin Laden and others kept releasing movies, I said, you know what, let's just do our own movie. And so we did a film called Killing in the Name. And what we didn't expect was that people actually wanted to see it, and they wanted to hear more about it. We thought we'd go to some schools and places that you probably never heard of and talk to students there, but people all over wanted to hear the message. And we were lucky enough to be nominated for Oscar this past year for short documentary. We didn't win, but it still meant we got to go to the Oscars and walk the red carpets at the Academy Awards. And I like to say it's one of the few places that terrorism victims have gotten to go, but not the terrorists. And then I realized maybe I shouldn't make that joke in case there is a threat to the Academy Awards. But luckily we survived, and we had quite an interesting time, and we've been thrilled to show the movie all over the world since then. It just launched on HBO in America, and hopefully it'll be on some pretty prominent networks in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia soon. So I can't show you the whole movie, but I did want to show you one person's story and show you the power of his one story in a list of many long stories, and how it's really created an impact for us to be able to have a conversation with people who maybe are sympathetic to what the terrorists have to say, but it's very hard for them to confront this man you're about to meet, Ashraf al-Khalid. So this is just our 90-second trailer.
Myself, I lost my father, I lost my father-in-law, and friends. They don't have the right to kill people in the name of God.
Hanya bully kan dicari itu. Mencari tempat Bali itu karena di situ memang banyaknya itu kan.
Dia sudah takdir suami saya bahwa malam itu dia kalau nggak pergi pasti dia nggak waktunya meninggal.
قتلى عظيما وهذه إلى الآن كما أعلم أنها أكبر عملية قام بها شخص واحد.
لو حكوا لرائد بدك تروح تسوي هيك لو إنه بنتحر عندهم ما نقدم على العمل هذا مش ممكن.
لو كان منح للذهاب أو لأمر الجهاد سوف نحاول.
لا تقل لي أنه الإسلام.
يقتلون المسلمون.
لا تقل لي أنه الإسلام.
So for any of you who are interested, you can talk to me later about seeing the film, and you can always watch us on our website, which is globalsurvivors.org. We also have a series of other films that we've released that were invited to be screened at Cannes this past year. So we've had quite an interesting year. And in June of this year, I had the opportunity to meet Henry. We both were invited to a Google Ideas Summit against violent extremism, which included about 70 former terrorists and a few survivors of terrorism, to talk about how we can get into the minds of those who might want to go down that path and what we can do to prevent it. And they put together an interesting short film that tackles some of the themes for former extremists. So if I indulge me, I'm going to show you another film.
For 20 years, I was a Muslim extremist.
My aunts, my uncles, my father, my cousins, everybody was a gang member.
They would hold me back and force me to watch as they stabbed my white English friends before my eyes.
Very early on, just not liking that sense of powerlessness.
I've stabbed 3 kids in my life, and I'm not proud of that.
When 9/11 happened, I actually celebrated the attacks.
The racist attacks led me to suffer an acute identity crisis.
I had to learn to fight back, or else I'd get abused even more.
My first encounter with a gang was when I was in 5th grade. I was 11 years old.
I went to the streets for camaraderie, comfort. That's where the gang members embraced me and welcomed me with open arms.
Gangs, cults, extremist groups provide a strong sense of solidarity and brotherhood.
A lot of it was not being alone anymore.
All of my friends were involved. It was more like a family structure.
I had no clue what the difference was between true respect and fear. You can never look weak. Weakness gets you killed.
A lot of fights, a lot of beatings.
We were taught to hate people who weren't Muslim and to regard ourselves as superior, that we are part of something important and noble, despite the evidence we see to the contrary.
We would have training sessions every week, solid for 2 hours, that were compulsory to attend.
If a young person is considering joining a gang, prepare to die.
I could name off the top of my head 50 people that I knew and cared about who were now dead, and I didn't want to be added to that list.
I tried to keep this kid who was from the neighborhood out. He was 14 years old and he was murdered. He's probably the main reason why I do the work that I do now for the past 10 years, helping young kids like that.
What we had originally started was actually destroying us from the inside.
My main goal is to just to take the term former and make it cool.
And the best solution is to make extremist ideas taboo through public awareness campaigns. Initiatives such as this at Google are wonderful for that.
So we're all learning how we can all work together in this big cohesive group.
I think that's what we human beings are all about, really, is our deep humanity. And I think this summit will manifest some incredibly profound human connections.
I joined the official IRA when I was 17. I shot and wounded a rival member of a paramilitary organization, went to prison for 2.5 years. I think my kind of aha moment was in prison, about 4 days when I went into prison. I was released into the prison yard. Unknowing to me, there were 150 other guys from the same organization of the guy I just shot. So after about a half an hour of severe kicking, beating, boiling water, brush offs, sort of taken off the yard into the hospital wing where I'm having my head stitched. In the corner is a television showing Wimbledon playing tennis. And I say, I've got something completely wrong here. This normality hit me like a train. And from that point, I began to think and question the extremist tactics and philosophy, the propaganda which I believed. I came out of prison, and in my neighborhood, there was a shooting of a young person quite similar to the shooting I'd carried out. And I went to the mother of her son who was shot, and I said, you might think this is hypocritical, but I did something similar, and I think that we need to do something about this. It's happening frequently in the neighborhood. So together we formed an organization called Families Against Intimidation and Terror. That organization developed strategies against terrorist organizations, documenting human rights abuses, exposing them internationally. And I like to think in some small way, the work of that particular group actually hastened the peace process in Northern Ireland. From then, I've obviously continued to work with groups, one particular group here in Brixton, the Street Project, a very innovative project, and work with other survivors and trying to develop community responses against extremism. And that's what led me to meet Carie at the Google Ideas Conference in June of this year.
So we sat together and we were thinking, what unites us? And for me, it is the power of the narrative. When you hear Henry's story, or if you hear mine or other survivors of terrorism stories, we have this unique ability to reach those who may be going down a path towards radicalization. And I would argue that while we have very different ways of going about it, we have the exact same end, which is to make sure it never happens again.
I completely disagree, Carie, in relation to the different paths. What really came out of the Google conference for me was here you have survivors and former extremists who've got two unique sets of skills which are not being harnessed. And that's really the big takeaway that I wanted to bring from the Google conference, because I think, and I'm not saying that survivors should work with former extremists. I've been in rooms where people have every right to walk out of it when I'm working with, particularly I'm thinking about the Omagh group. The Omagh group came out of that very sad bombing in Omagh where 29 people were murdered and 2 unborn children by the real IRA. I was contacted by one of the survivors of that because the police couldn't get any forensic evidence or any prosecutions. So together, that collaboration brought about the civil case, first civil case that sued the terrorist organization. So that was using both unique sets of skills. And also, about 8 years ago, I spotted the growth of this terrorist group, the Real IRA, which unfortunately are still active in Northern Ireland. They had a website, would you believe it, which was collecting money. It was propaganda. They were issuing threats via it. And this was a website based out of New Jersey. So we thought we just simply had to contact the head of the host and say, look, these are the bad guys, this is what they've done, take them off. But they refused to do that. And for 8 years, we contacted everybody, used every method to no avail, until one day I spotted a Bupa private health ad that appeared on the site and froze it and sent it to the survivor. And together with our contacts within Bupa, obviously were appalled that their ad had found its way onto their site. Within 2 hours, the website was closed down. And you know, the interesting thing was people kept telling us over 8 years that they'll just reopen the site tomorrow morning. What's the point? 2 years later, they haven't.
It's pretty impressive. I think from my perspective, you know, we haven't had that many former extremists actually approach survivors to work with us, and we've been able to make a lot of inroads, and one of the ways we have obviously done it is through the film. And in fact, I'm thinking of an opportunity that we had here in London, although it was South London and Brixton, with the Street program, which is this group of people working with radicalized youth here in London to bring them back towards a place of peace. And they put together an opportunity for me to screen Killing in the Name with kids who had been in prison. So they're all former convicts who had been radicalized in prison. And, you know, we watched the film and we talked about the film, and I thought that that would be it. And it turns out it wasn't, because one of the kids said to me, "Hey, wait a minute, you said your mom was in one of the planes." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "But how can that be? Because we were told by the guys who gave us these radical ideas in prison that there were no passengers on any of the planes. So I don't understand." And I realized sitting there watching him, I didn't need to say anything else. He knew I wasn't lying. I can't really lie about it. And I gave him some pretty graphic details of body parts that we've gotten back from my mom. And you knew that suddenly his whole foundation on which these radical beliefs had been built began to crumble. And to me, that was so powerful. And it didn't need to be someone who'd gone down that path. It was just giving him the information that he didn't have access to before. And we had another incident in Indonesia showing Killing in the Name. We translated it into Bahasa and went to schools where a lot of the people who actually committed some of the atrocities in Indonesia were trained. And we showed the film, and suddenly a kid stands up and says, "You know, I actually agree with what the terrorist just said." And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. We've got this, you know, budding terrorist right in front of me. And what was so great is that he felt, one, safe enough to make that comment, and we created a safe place for him to honestly tell us how he felt. And then two, we had teachers there to say, "No, you don't understand. And here's where they're lying to you, and here's where they're wrong." So it didn't need to come from me. It came from experts in their holy book. But it was this very unique opportunity for us to be able to do that.
And I think that's why this conference is so important, and for us to be able to speak at it. Innovation, terrorists are very innovative in terms of the technology they use, the internet, and it doesn't really belong to them. You know, the power of the internet should be for good, and we shouldn't really treat it like a trade union employer dispute. You know, there are lots of things we can do to not give them that platform to influence young people and radicalize young people.
I think what's really interesting, and you know, we already had it be mentioned earlier today by George Dyson, talked about what Churchill has been able to do back at Bletchley Park, and how he was able to bring together a whole dynamic group of thinkers, whether it was artists or painters or technologists or crossword puzzle experts, to be able to solve the problems of their time. And we need your help, everyone in this room. I look out and I see all these people who know so much more about so many things that I'll never know. And we have this powerful narrative, but we don't necessarily have the platform, and we don't necessarily have the power to be able to get it out there. And I'm hopeful that you in this room will be able to help us get that and help us solve the problems of a generation that we have right now.
I definitely echo that, and just say that I think I can say this on behalf of you, Carie, that I hope you never get the knowledge that we both collectively have, or ever have to have that knowledge.
Well, thank you very much.